A rich old man paid me to clean his house, but over time, he started harassing me. The ad was simple. Cleaning help needed for an estate outside the city. Good pay. Discretion required. I didn't hesitate. Rent was overdue, my fridge was empty, and I'd cleaned worse places before. The drive out of town took longer than expected. Paved roads turned to gravel, then dirt. By the time I reached the gates, the sky had dimmed to a moody gray. The mansion was enormous, a relic from another era. It had that too quiet quality that made my skin prickle. The iron gates creaked open as if expecting me, and the long driveway led to a house with windows like watchful eyes. The man who answered the door was Edwin Albrecht, a name I'd only later realize had history. At first glance, he was just an old mantel, thin, neatly dressed in an expensive-looking suit. His hair was white, combed back like he'd stepped out of a different century. His smile was pleasant but never quite reached his eyes. "You must be the cleaner." His voice was smooth, practiced. I nodded. "That's me. Come in." The house smelled of polished wood and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. "I'm alone here," he said, leading me down a hallway where the lights flickered. "I like my privacy. You'll be paid well, but you'll need to follow my rules." I wasn't in the position to argue. "Of course." He handed me a list. "Do not enter the east wing. Do not move anything that looks misplaced. If you hear noises at night, ignore them." My stomach twisted at the last one. "If you hear noises at night, ignore them." I forced a laugh. "Is your house haunted?" Albrecht looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled again. "Number, just old." The job started easy. Dusting, vacuuming, scrubbing marble floors that probably hadn't seen a mop in years. The place was eerily clean for a house supposedly in need of a maid. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was erasing the presence of someone who wasn't supposed to be here. There were signs of another persona glass left on the table, a book open on a chair, a faint scent of perfume in the hallway. But I never saw anyone but Albrecht. By noon, I was wiping down the library shelves when I heard it. A soft creak. I turned. Nothing. Just the high-backed chairs and endless rows of books. Then, another noise. A whisper. I froze. The hairs on my arms stood up. My gaze landed on a heavy door at the end of the room, the east wing. The forbidden area. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Maybe the house was just settling. Maybe I was overthinking. Then, from behind the door, I heard it. A breath. Not mine. Not the house. I backed away, forcing myself to breathe. My eyes flicked toward the hallway, half expecting Albrecht to be watching. But he wasn't there. I finished the day in tense silence. That night, as I gathered my things, Albrecht appeared. "You worked hard today," he said. "Good workers are hard to find." I muttered a polite thanks, ready to go. But as I reached for the doorknob, his hand closed over mine. I went rigid. His grip was light, almost casual, but his fingers lingered too long. "Stay for dinner," he said. I swallowed. "Two should go." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes darkened. "Of course. Tomorrow, then." I nodded stiffly and left. As I walked to my car, I glanced up. From one of the darkened windows, a figure stood watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself I imagined it. The figure in the window, the whisper behind the east wing door, Albrecht's lingering touch. Maybe I was just jumpy. But when I arrived the next morning, something felt different. The air inside the mansion was heavier, like it had been waiting for me. Albrecht greeted me at the door, dressed in a crisp, dark suit like the day before. He always looked too polished, too deliberate, like someone who had spent years perfecting the image of a gentleman. "You came back," he said smoothly, as if he doubted I would. I forced a smile. "Of course. A job's a job." His eyes lingered on me a second too long before he stepped aside. "Good." I went to work, keeping my head down, but the unease wouldn't fade. Every room I cleaned felt wrong, like I was disturbing something that didn't want to be disturbed. By noon, I was in the dining room, polishing the long wooden table, when Albrecht appeared behind me. I hadn't heard him enter. "You're quite thorough," he said. I tensed. "I try to do a good job." He stepped closer. "I appreciate that in a person. Hard work, loyalty. His voice was calm, but there was something in it, something that made my stomach clench. I cleared my throat. Do you want me to clean the library next? He studied me for a moment, then smiled. Number I want you to sit. I hesitated. His gaze hardened. Not a request, a command. I forced myself into a chair. He sat across from me, watching. His fingers tapped against the table. Slow, rhythmic. Tell me about yourself, he said. I blinked. What? I pay you to be here. It's only fair I know something about you. I didn't like where this was going. Not much to tell, I said, keeping my voice light. Just trying to make ends meet. Albrecht smiled, but his eyes were cold. No family? I shook my head. Good, he said, leaning back. That makes things simpler. I didn't ask what he meant. I just swallowed my unease and excused myself back to work. Whispers in the house. That evening, as I dusted the second-floor hallway, I heard it again. A whisper. Soft, urgent, coming from the east wing. I turned, heart pounding. The forbidden door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. It had been locked yesterday. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. The whispering grew louder, more desperate. Then, a thud, like something there's someone hitting the door from the other side. I spun around and nearly screamed. Albrecht was standing a few feet behind me. I told you not to go near that wing, he said, his voice low. I took a step back. I wasn't. His face remained unreadable, but the air between us crackled with something dark. He reached out, and for a second, I thought he would grab my wrist. But he didn't. Instead, he closed the door. Slowly. Deliberately. Then, without another word, he walked away. The feeling of being watched. By the time I left, my nerves were shot. As I walked to my car, I felt it again, that awful prickling sensation of being watched. I turned sharply. The upstairs window. A shadow moved behind the glass. It wasn't Albrecht. It was someone else. Someone trapped inside that house. My pulse hammered as I fumbled for my keys, got in the car, and drove away. I told myself I wouldn't come back. But deep down, I already knew I would. Because something in that house wanted me to. I should have quit. I should have blocked his number, ignored his messages, and never driven down that godforsaken road again. But I did. Maybe it was the money. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe the house had already pulled me in. The third day was different. When I arrived, the front door was already open. I hesitated before stepping inside. The house was silent. No sign of Albrecht. Something felt wrong. I called out, "Mr. Albrecht?" No answer. I took a few cautious steps inside, closing the door behind me. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though I saw no fire. The chandeliers above cast flickering light, creating long, distorted shadows along the floor. Then I heard him. A voice from the dark hallway. "You came back." I turned sharply. Albrecht stood just beyond the shadows watching me. Something in his eyes had changed. He looked satisfied, like he'd won something. "I wasn't sure you'd return," he said, stepping forward. I forced a nervous laugh. "Well, I did." Albrecht smiled. "Good." Then he lifted his hand and tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear. I went completely still. My skin crawled. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he stepped past me, as if nothing had happened. "I need you to clean my study today," he said over his shoulder. "Come." I let out a breath, my pulse hammering. I should have walked out, but I didn't. The study was darker than the rest of the house, lined with ancient bookshelves and heavy curtains that swallowed the light. Albrecht sat in a leather chair, watching as I dusted the shelves. He didn't speak, just sat there, sipping his tea, his eyes never leaving me. Minutes stretched into an hour. I was hyper-aware of his gaze. Every movement, every shift of my body, I felt him studying it. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "You have a lovely figure." My breath caught. I turned slowly. He was still seated, his teacup in hand, like he hadn't just said something completely inappropriate. "You think you?" I said stiffly, gripping the rag in my hand. His lips curled. That wasn't a compliment. I swallowed hard. I should get back to work. He tilted his head. Are you uncomfortable? I forced a smile. Not at all. Lie. His expression darkened, like he knew I was lying. Then, just as quickly, he smiled again. Good. I turned back to my work, every muscle in my body tight with fear. That evening, as I finished cleaning, I made a mistake. I reached for a cabinet in the study, a small wooden drawer. I only wanted to dust it. I didn't think. But the moment my fingers touched the handle, Albrecht's voice cut through the room like a blade. Don't touch that. I yanked my hand back. My heart pounded. I turned to find him standing closer than before. Too close. His eyes weren't just cold now, they were dangerous. It's private, he said softly. I nodded quickly. Of course. I wasn't. I know, he interrupted. But you will learn to respect boundaries. I forced a nod, suddenly desperate to leave. Albrecht exhaled and stepped back, his smile returning like a mask. That will be all for today. I muttered a quick goodbye and hurried toward the door. But as I reached it, I heard something strange. A whisper. Not from Albrecht. From inside the locked cabinet, I froze. Then, before I could react, Albrecht touched my shoulder. I nearly jumped out of my skin. He chuckled. Something wrong? I shook my head too quickly. Nothing. Just tired. His fingers trailed down my arm before pulling away. Then get some rest. Tomorrow we'll have dinner. I wanted to say no, but when I looked at his face, I knew he wasn't asking. As I left that night, I did something I hadn't done before. I turned back, and when I did, I saw it. A handprint, pressed against the second-floor window. Small. Too small to be Albrecht's. I swallowed hard. I wasn't alone in that house. And whoever else was there wanted me to know it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the handprint on the window. Someone else was in that house. Someone who wanted me to notice. I should have reported it. I should have never gone back. But the fear had changed. It wasn't just about Albrecht anymore. It was about who was trapped in that house. When I arrived the next evening, Albrecht was waiting at the door. For the first time, he looked excited. You're just in time, he said, his smile wider than usual. Dinner is ready. I hesitated. I should clean first. He shook his head. Number tonight, you'll sit with me. My stomach twisted. But I knew better than to argue. The dining room table was already set 2 plates, 2 glasses of red wine. The food was steaming. Steak, potatoes, something rich and heavy that I had no appetite for. Albrecht sat across from me, watching as I slowly picked up my fork. Eat, he said. I forced a bite. It was tender, cooked perfectly. But I could barely swallow. Albrecht took a slow sip of wine. I used to have a wife, he said suddenly. I stiffened. He'd never mentioned a wife before. She was very beautiful, he continued. But beauty fades. People fade. He smiled like it was an inside joke. I forced my expression to stay neutral. What happened to her? His eyes gleamed. She left. A chill ran down my spine. Left or disappeared. I set my fork down, my palms sweaty. I should finish my work. Albrecht tilted his head, watching me closely. You seem nervous. I forced a laugh. I'm just tired. He didn't move. For a long moment, I thought he would stop me from leaving the table. Then, finally, he leaned back. Very well. But before you go... His hand reached across the table, gripping mine. My breath caught. His fingers were cold, but his grip was firm. He squeezed. Just a little. Just enough to remind me that he could. Then he let go. Be careful, he murmured. I didn't reply. I just stood and left the dining room as quickly as I could. I went straight to the second floor. Straight to the east wing. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I approached the locked door at the end of the hall, the one Albrecht had warned me about. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then a faint breath. My pulse hammered. Someone was in there. Someone alive. I grabbed the handle and turned it. Locked. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. How do I get in? Then, I remembered the cabinet in Albrecht's study, the one he told me not to touch. It had to be there. The key. I turned and hurried downstairs. I entered the study quietly, heart pounding. Albrecht was still in the dining room. I crept toward the forbidden drawer. My hands trembled as I gripped the handle and pulled. Locked. I swallowed my panic. Think. Think. My eyes darted across the room. A letter opener. I grabbed it and jammed it into the lock, twisting, prying until finally, with a quiet click, the drawer slid open. Inside, among a stack of yellowed papers, was a single brass key. I snatched it and turned only to find Albrecht standing in the doorway. I froze. His expression was blank, too blank. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then softly he said, "That was very foolish." I didn't hesitate. I ran. I sprinted down the hall, Albrecht's footsteps close behind. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking as I reached the east wing door. Albrecht's voice was eerily calm. "Stop now, and I won't hurt you." I didn't stop. I shoved the key into the lock and twisted. The door flew open. I stumbled inside and slammed it shut behind me, locking it again just as Albrecht slammed his fist against the wood. Then I turned, and I saw her. A woman, thin, pale, hollow-eyed. She was chained to the radiator. Her wrists were bruised. Her lips cracked. She looked up at me, and for the first time in days, someone else in this house was afraid too. "Help me," she whispered. I swallowed the scream rising in my throat. The pounding on the door grew louder. I had seconds before Albrecht got in. I had seconds to save us both. I grabbed the chains, my fingers working frantically to free her. "Can you walk?" I whispered. She nodded weakly. Then the lock behind me turned. My blood ran cold. The door swung open, and Albrecht stepped inside. Albrecht stepped into the room, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. Behind me, the woman trembled, her wrists raw where the chains had bitten into her skin. Albrecht exhaled, shaking his head. "You shouldn't have done that." His voice was calm, almost disappointed. I backed up, my body blocking the woman. My mind raced fight or run. Albrecht closed the door behind him. "You don't understand," he said softly. "She belongs to me." The woman let out a choked sob. "Please, don't let him take me." Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the nearest objecta, rusted lamp hand, swung it with everything I had. It smashed into Albrecht's shoulder. He staggered, his expression twisting into something dark, something not human. I didn't wait. I grabbed the woman's arm and ran. We sprinted through the hallway, down the grand staircase. Albrecht's footsteps followed, too fast. The woman was weak, barely able to run, but adrenaline kept her moving. We reached the front door. I grabbed the handle. Locked. My heart nearly stopped. I twisted, pulled, slammed my fist against the wood. Albrecht's voice drifted down the stairs. "You think it's that easy?" I turned. He stood at the top of the staircase, smiling. Like this was a game. Like he was enjoying this. I grabbed a chair and hurled it at the nearest window. Glass shattered. Cold air rushed in. The woman let out a sob of relief. I climbed through first, then pulled her after me. Albrecht's voice was suddenly sharp, furious. "Don't you dare!" He moved fast. Too fast. His hand caught my wrist. A surge of pure terror shot through me. I kicked back, my boot slamming into his knee. He let out a hiss of pain. And in that split second, I tore free. The woman and I hit the ground running. We ran into the trees, branches whipping against our faces. Behind us, I heard him, not shouting, laughing. Low, deep, like he knew something we didn't. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. The woman gasped, stumbling. "I can't." I grabbed her arm. "Yes, you can. Just a little further." The trees blurred around us. The night was too quiet. Then headlights. A car. My heart nearly exploded. We burst from the woods, waving frantically. The car screeched to a stop. A man got out. "What the hell?" "Help us," I gasped. Behind me, Albrecht stepped from the trees. The driver's face paled. I turned, and I swear Albrecht wasn't even out of breath. Just watching. Just smiling. The driver hesitated. "What's going on?" The woman grabbed his sleeve. Please, get us out of here. Something in her voice, pure, raw terror, finally convinced him. Get in, he said. We threw ourselves into the car. The tires spun against the dirt, kicking up dust as we sped away. I turned to look out the back window. Albrecht stood motionless in the road, watching us disappear. His smile never faded. The police didn't believe us at first. The woman, her name was Elena, was barely coherent, too traumatized to speak. But when they investigated the mansion, they found the chains. They found her blood. They found other things too. Things they wouldn't tell me about. And Albrecht? Gone. Vanished without a trace. No records, no bank accounts, no history of even owning the mansion. Like he had never existed. Days passed. Weeks. Elena was taken into protective custody. She didn't want to talk about what had happened to her. I didn't push. I just wanted to forget. But some nights, I wake up thinking I hear his voice, whispering in the dark, and every now and then, I see him, a glimpse in a crowd, a shadow in a doorway, watching, waiting, smiling, like it isn't over, like it will never be over. In general, write your opinion about this story. You can also share yours in the comments. It will be interesting to read. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Your support is very important to me. Take care of yourself.